change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And then chapter 23, it starts with, Then they told David, saying, Look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they're robbing the threshing floors. Now this message should have went to King Saul, because it was King Saul's responsibility, because it's his job to protect Keilah, to fight against the Philistines. But Saul, he's not doing his job these days. Saul is too busy killing God's priests and sending out his army to capture David than to fight the real enemies of Israel. In Keilah, it was a border town in Judah, and it's only 12 miles away from the Philistine city of Gath, and it's only 10 miles from where David is camping in Hereth. And at harvest time, it's always a very vulnerable time for the people of Keilah, because the Philistines were a marauding people, and so they're out looking for food. Where the Philistines, they would wait till the farmers did all their work. So they did all their plowing and they did all their planting and the nurturing of the crops. They let them do the work all the way to the harvest. And then when the harvest was all threshed and the food was processed, that's when they would come and steal the crops. So this time of year, the Philistines were always out looking for food, and Saul, he would have known this, and he should have sent a detachment of troops to protect Keilah during the harvest season, and he should have been concerned about defending the people. But instead, Saul, he's obsessed with finding David. And so here, the Lord is allowing this message to come to David. And David, he doesn't just take the information and he doesn't say, well, that's not my problem. This is Saul's problem. What David does is he inquires of the Lord to see if there was something that the Lord wanted him to do about it, instead of just letting the people of Keilah suffer. And so David, he inquires of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack the Philistines? And the Lord said, go and attack the Philistines. Go save Keilah. And that's because David is the anointed king. And the people of Keilah are the people that belong to that kingdom that David will one day rule. And so David, he's to act like a king, even though he wasn't a king yet. And you have to see here also that David, he didn't go to Keilah on his own initiative. He didn't try to fix the problem without the Lord's direction, as if he were their savior. And we don't know how David inquired of the Lord here, and we don't know how the Lord answered his inquiry, because it looks like Abiathar, the high priest with the ephod, that he doesn't show up to David until David is in the city of Keilah. And so David, he may have received this word from the Lord here from maybe like the prophet Gad, because the prophet Gad, he was with David, but we don't know for sure. And David's men here, they don't see this the same way that David does. They feel like they have enough problems of their own without going out and fighting the Philistines. They think they have enough problems just trying to stay ahead of Saul and his army. But you have to remember, this is a new group of people, and they're not a regular army. This is a group that's made up of 400 disgruntled men with David as captain. So they basically tell David that they don't want to go. And David here, he listens to his men. He doesn't just say, hey, I'm the captain. You'll do what I say. Because the truth is that none of these men, none of them have to be here. So David, he hears them, he listens to them to the point where he's willing to seek the Lord a second time to make sure that he heard the Lord right. And so the second time David inquired of the Lord not only confirmed his word, but he also made David a promise here that he would deliver the Philistines into their hands. And the way you can think of this, you can kind of think of this like a church, where David is their captain. He is their shepherd leader, and he's leading only those that believe in his leadership, leading them into the Lord's battle. And if someone doesn't believe in where David's leading them, they're free to go and they're free to follow somebody else. But these men have chosen David's leadership because they don't like the way Saul is leading. And it was the same way with Jesus. His disciples, they never got a vote where they were going next, but they followed Jesus freely because they trusted in his leadership. And so David, he leads these men into battle, and the Lord does exactly what he said he would do, and they defeated the invading army, and they got a lot of spoil from the Philistines. They got a whole bunch of cattle. So David and his men, they move into Keilah, and they're treated like heroes because they are heroes. They saved Keilah. And this is where Abiathar the priest, where he actually comes to David after fleeing the destruction in Nob, though we saw that conversation they had before in the last chapter. And by being the only living descendant of Elimelech, by default, he becomes the new high priest. And it says that he came with an ephod. Now, an ephod is just an apron, because a lot of the work of a priest was butchering animals. And so all the priests, they wore white linen ephods, an apron. But I don't think this was just an ephod. This was the ephod. This is the ephod of the high priest, which was not white, it was blue, where it had attached to its front the breastplate with the gemstones, which was the pocket that held the Urim and the Thummim. And this is how David will inquire of the Lord from now on through the help of Abiathar the priest. And this is exactly what Elimelech was accused of doing for David. But here now, Abiathar, he will inquire for David, and he will do it freely of his own free will. And so now David, he hears that Saul is on his way to Keilah. And being in Keilah with Saul coming down, that's a bad place to be, because Keilah is a walled city, and they'll be trapped. And what we need to see here is that God actually led them here. Sometimes we can find ourselves in a bad place, but that doesn't always mean that we're out of God's will for our life, that God may have even led us there. And here we see Saul, who couldn't be troubled to deliver the men from Keilah from the Philistine. But now that David's there and he's trapped himself in this walled city with nowhere to go, now Saul, he can make time in his schedule to go to Keilah. In fact, he can't get down there fast enough. And so David, knowing that this is not a good place with Saul coming, he inquires of the Lord. And this time it is through Abiathar using the ephod. And David asks the Lord two questions. Will they come down? Will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hands of Saul? And if you notice that the questions are framed in yes or no questions. And some people believe that's how the Urim and the Thummim worked, that you would ask a question and it would be whatever color stone that came out of the pouch. That would be your yes or no answer. But nobody really knows for sure how the Urim and Thummim worked. But the Lord did tell David, Saul will come down and the men of Keilah, they will deliver you up. And you would think the people of Keilah, that they would know this isn't how you're supposed to treat the kind of people who save you. But then you have to also remember, Saul is unstable, and he just killed the whole village of Nob to be able to get David. And so he would have no problem killing all the people of Keilah either, especially if they were giving refuge to David. So instead of staying and fighting Saul, David leaves. And by him removing himself from Keilah, he probably saved the people of Keilah again. And when Saul found out David escaped Keilah, he halted his expedition. In fact, with David leaving Keilah, he actually took that decision from the men of Keilah who would be willing to betray him. He took that decision away from them. And you'll never see David ever hold a grudge against the people of Keilah. And then we end here with seeing David leaving with more men than he came with, because he started with 400 and now he's leaving with 600. So next week, we'll start again with David in the wilderness of Ziph. And really, the real lesson here is be a David, don't be a Saul. Definitely don't be a Doeg. So last week, we saw how King Saul had murdered the priests of Nob for unknowingly helping David. where David now is safe in the forest of Hereth, when God had sent David and his men to deliver the people of Keilah from the Philistines. And then we saw last week God warning David that Saul was coming and that the men of Keilah, that they would give David and his men up to Saul. So David and his men left Keilah. And so this week, it isn't much different for David, because when David left Keilah, he went to the wilderness of Ziph, where Ziph is just a small town at the most southern point of the Dead Sea. And Ziph, it means refining place. And Saul sought David here again on this rugged wilderness, and he did this every day. And what's funny here is where Saul, he can't find David, but Jonathan, he finds David right away, which means Saul's spies, they must have brought back enough intelligence for Jonathan to be able to figure out where David was. And so Jonathan, he goes to David in the forest of Ziph. And the reason for Jonathan's coming, it was only to strengthen David and God. And he tells David not to fear. Saul won't find you. You will be the king of Israel. And my father, he knows it. And all these things that Jonathan is telling David are true. And then Jonathan can see all this, but David, he can't see this at this time. And the only thing that Jonathan said that wasn't true is that he said that he would be next to David when he's king, because he won't be. He won't be next to David because Jonathan, he's not going to live that long. This is the last time David ever will see Jonathan, because the next time we see Jonathan, he will have been slain by the Philistines. And he'll have his head decapitated, and his body will be strapped to a wall in Beth Shan. But before Jonathan leaves to go home here, David and Jonathan, they renew their covenant. And David, still being in the land of Ziph, the people of Ziph, the Ziphites, they go out of their way and they travel all the way up to Gibeah just to betray David to Saul. And it's kind of hard to understand why the Ziphites would take Saul's side, because these guys, they're from the tribe of Judah. But it may be that they might think they will be rewarded somehow, or maybe they think it's just patriotic. And the Ziphites, they find Saul and they tell him that they will actually deliver David into his hands. And Saul, he is so self-deceived. He thinks this is from God. At least he's telling the Ziphites that it's from God. And so Saul, he blesses them for feeling sorry for him. And Saul says, "Blessed are you of the Lord." Where Saul here, he's pretty much claiming that he's on the Lord's side. And then he warns the Ziphites that David is crafty. And David, he wrote a psalm about this event, about the Ziphites and their betrayal, and that's Psalm 54. But by the time that Saul was able to get down to Ziph, David had moved to the wilderness of Maon, which is only 3 miles away from Ziph. And so now Saul, he goes to Maon, and Saul almost has David trapped on a mountain, which they later name the Rock of Escape. Where Saul, he had divided his men, and they were encircling the mountain, trying to catch David in the middle. Or David's men were going back and forth from one side of the mountain to the other to avoid Saul's army, where Saul's army would eventually be able to trap David. And it doesn't seem that Saul knew how close he was to catching David. But David, he escapes when God sends this message to Saul that the Philistines have invaded the land. And this is when David, he goes down to En-Gedi, which is 15 miles northeast from this wilderness he's staying in Maon. And En-Gedi, it means spring of a goat. And En-Gedi is a beautiful place. It's like a paradise filled with waterfalls and vegetation and wildlife. It's kind of like an oasis in the middle of a desert wilderness. And En-Gedi, it has tons of caves. And it's 20 miles southeast of Bethlehem, 23 miles from Jerusalem. And so David, he would be familiar with the caves of En-Gedi because there is a spring of water that travels all the way from Jerusalem, then it goes through Bethlehem till it gets all the way down to En-Gedi. So David, he would have followed that spring and then he would have taken his sheep out there. And this is a good place to go if you wanted to hide and to be left alone, because there's so many caves in En-Gedi. So it would be really hard to find someone. So after Saul has pushed back the Philistines, after that attack that called him away from pursuing David, Saul hears that David is in En-Gedi. And so it says he takes 3,000 chosen men of Israel, which means that these are the very best of Saul's soldiers. And they're all walking along this path called the Rocks of the Wild Goats. And it says they came to the sheepfold by the road. And a sheepfold here, all it means is that they came to large caves. These are large caves that are large enough to shelter sheep. And because the Bible is a real book and it's about real people and they're living real daily lives, we see that Saul, that he has personal needs that he needs to attend to. And so Saul, he goes into a cave. And where our text, it says, Saul went to attend to his needs. This is a polite way to say that he went into the cave to go to the bathroom. In our text, it doesn't tell us if Saul went into the cave to go number 1 or number 2. But for those of you who want to know, this is the kind of relieving yourself where you have to remove your robes. And that's what Saul does. He removes his robes and he lays them aside to do his business. So it's really easy to figure out why nobody wanted to go into the cave to protect Saul or to watch over him. They just figured they'd wait outside and give the man his privacy. And so here you have Saul, and he thinks he's all alone. But Saul picked the wrong cave. He picked the cave with David and his 600 men, who are all squished up against the back wall of that cave. And they're hiding because they're all waiting for those 3,000 choice men of Saul's to pass by them. So they're as quiet as a peep. At this time, with Saul doing his business, I don't think I would have been that excited to be one of David's mighty men. But they're all acting like they just won the lottery. And they're whispering to David and they're saying, this is a God thing. And nobody sees this as being a coincidence. And they're all saying, David, this is exactly what God told you. And David, men, they're all quoting to David something that they had heard somewhere about a promise that God had made to David. Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you. But this doesn't set right with David, because David, he doesn't see Saul as his enemy. It's only Saul who sees David as his enemy. It's Saul who's the one who sees things wrong. And so all these 600 men, these are all 600 friends to David. And they've all seen what David has gone through because of this man, Saul. Because Saul is the man who's taken everything away from David. He took away his home, his job. They took away his wife. He's even made David's family go into exile to Moab. And all these men, they're going through all the same trials that David's going through, where every day you're having to look over your shoulder to see if Saul's there. And now this could all be over with just one blow. So this has to be God. Who else could set this up? And so they're just saying, just do to Saul what he would do to you. Nobody could ever blame you for that. God has delivered Saul to you. And this is where we need to be real careful in our lives, where we need to be careful to who we listen to when we're in the middle of a long trial, to be careful of the counsel of the people who love us the most when you're going through difficult times, or all those people who love you, where all they can see is your pain, and they would say anything just to make your suffering go away, because they're more concerned about your comfort than about your character. And they're going to tell you what they would do if they were you. And they'll tell you that's also what God would do. But here, it's not what God would do. This is only the counsel of friends. This is the counsel of those who love us in life. So David, he takes this opportunity to sneak up close to Saul, close enough to cut the hem of Saul's robe that Saul had laid aside. And Saul probably couldn't hear David coming because of the noise of the 3,000 soldiers that are outside of the cave. But after doing just this, just after cutting Saul's robe, David's heart, it starts to condemn him. And it's telling him this isn't right. And this really shows us how sensitive David's heart is. And it's not because David's weak, because David's not weak. David kills giants. David kills tens of thousands. And it's not because David's afraid. It's because it's wrong in the eyes of God. And David, he knows it. Because Saul is God's anointed. Saul is God's problem. Because this is a lot different than killing somebody on the battlefield. And this is a lot different than trying to kill somebody in self-defense. This is murdering somebody unexpectedly. This is to assassinate a king, which is very different. David, in his life, he never planned to kill Saul. It had never crossed his mind. And how could David kill Saul and ever be able to face his best friend Jonathan, Saul's son, or to face Michal, David's own wife, Saul's daughter? And if David did this, no one would have ever known that it was God who had given David the kingdom. It would look like David had taken the kingdom by force, by killing Israel's king. And he would have looked like a much different man to us than the man that we know. Because this isn't facing a Goliath. This is taking advantage of a man at his weakest and most vulnerable point when he's incapacitated. There is no honor in this, but it was tempting. It was very tempting to be able to make his problems go away. And so David, he crawls back to his men and he tells his men what the Lord thinks, because David is the only one who's being led by the Holy Spirit here, where nobody else is being led in this way. And this verse, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is anointed of the Lord. And you'll always hear Christians use this verse, or they'll use this other phrase that says, touch not the Lord's anointed. But they take this verse out of context and they'll use it, and they'll use it in saying that you can't criticize a pastor or you can't criticize a teaching because that man, he's the Lord's anointed. He's untouchable, or else you're going to be in trouble. And most of the time when I've ever heard this verse applied, it's always been to someone who actually teaches false doctrines, where you'll hear it used a lot with those people who are called the faith teachers, to those teachers who teach a prosperity gospel. But here, David is not trying to persuade anyone from criticizing Saul. All he's saying by this verse is that he's not going to kill Saul. And now, with David's heart troubling him, for just cutting off a piece of his robe, David says, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. And so David, he's not listening to his men here. And he's telling them that this isn't the Lord's will. And he tells his men, Saul's anointed, and this is God's problem. It's God's business. It's not my business. I'm not going to kill him.
Let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,